lawmakers.
A few months ago, three women of African descent, Beatriz Gomes Dias, Romualda Fernandes, and Joacine Katar Moreira, made history, becoming the first black women elected to parliament in Portugal. They come from different parties, but they shared a commitment to combating racism in Portuguese society. It was as though that society then wanted to prove their point. The women have faced all kinds of racist abuse on social media. In the mainstream media, the hostility was more subtle but no less direct. Portuguese commentators and news columnists have contested the idea that racism even exists there. They argue that somehow the Portuguese, unlike other Europeans, are immune to racism, that they are uniquely colorblind. This is a story that, while set in the modern day, is rooted in a rose-tinted view of the country's history, its colonial past. The Listening Post's Daniel Turinao on a state of denial, the reporting of race in the Portuguese media.
Senhoras e senhores, a cabeça de lista do Livre por Lisboa, Joacine Katar Moreira.
This is Joacine Katar Moreira. In October, she and two other women became Portugal's first female lawmakers of African descent.
Seremos no Parlamento a esquerda antifascista.
Moreira's candidacy had a magnetic effect on the Portuguese media.
Mulher, afrodescendente e gaga.
Not just for the color of her skin, but also the fact that she speaks with a stutter.
Eu gaguejo quando falo, não gaguejo quando eu penso.
Nossa campanha foi uma...
Our campaign had several themes. We talked about the environment, health, education, economics, science, and so on. But the media never looked at me as a candidate with a program for Portugal. They looked at me as a black woman who speaks with a stutter.
O seu programa ideológico foi eu sou preta, gaga e pobre.
And yet, every time I talked about racism, the media used that against me.
Contra mim.
Estas discriminações são seculares, são estruturais, são frutos do racismo estrutural.
Moreira's critique of racism on Portugal's streets and in its institutions drew a common reaction from opinion makers right across the media spectrum, one of denial.
The director of Sol newspaper responded to the parties who were making that critique by saying that Portugal isn't a racist country and that therefore policies to combat racism don't make sense. In the online right-wing paper Observador, there were numerous columnists who denied the existence of racism. I ask, how do they, as white men, manage to affirm with so much conviction that non-white people don't suffer racism?
O racismo sempre...
Racism has always been obvious for the people who suffer from it. Here's an example. In Portugal, there is a lot of distrust among ethnic minorities about the police. Currently, there are 18 policemen on trial for racially abusing and torturing 6 young black men who were in their custody. Add to that the reports that there are many far-right individuals inside the police force, and it only increases the mistrust among communities of colour.
Comunidades racializadas.
For many in Portugal's black community, the media's reporting of police violence is an ongoing source of frustration. In January of last year, this video went viral. Police officers beating a 63-year-old black man and his family in the Bairro da Jamaica district of Lisbon. That drew hundreds of protesters onto the streets, and when a few threw stones at the police, the response came in rubber bullets. 70 public figures of African descent then wrote a letter, published in the newspaper Jornal Tornado, condemning the media's coverage. Mamadou Ba was one of them.
Normalmente, Normally, when there are protests in the more upmarket part of Lisbon, the coverage tends to be more objective, conveying the motivations and the demands of the protesters.
O grito final de milhares de homens em protesto. Só não subimos porque não queremos.
In the case of the January 2019 protests, it was the opposite. Journalists began by criminalizing the protesters.
E foi aí que a polícia se viu obrigada a disparar balas de borracha porque, segundo a PSP, os manifestantes estavam a atirar pedras aos agentes.
They adopted the same narrative as the police, who were looking for excuses to disguise their violence and brutality.
In the testimonies given by the young protesters, many of them said they were shot with rubber bullets while they were protesting completely peacefully. That tells us that journalists don't manage to look beyond stereotypes. And so when they come to write the news, they're sometimes lacking in objectivity.
As nossas polícias são essenciais para defender a liberdade e a segurança e, portanto, devem merecer aqui o nosso apoio.
The tendency is to follow those stereotypes, stereotypes which they also help to spread.
Que eles próprios também ajudam a veicular.
Olá, sejam muito bem-vindos a mais um episódio.
The media debates around the Bairro da Jamaica story contained a familiar theme: denial. In this case, about racism in the police.
Eu, Rodrigo, levo. Não tenho grandes hipóteses de me recusar a ser detido. Também levo até entrar dentro do carro. Seja eu branco, amarelo, azul.
A columnist for Expresso magazine put it bluntly. In Portugal, he wrote, institutional racism does not and cannot exist. The idea that Portugal is a kind of noble exception to the realities of European racism is one that you'll find pretty much across the media here. But the online newspaper Observador has been especially prolific in spreading that view. I'm on my way to speak to the editor-in-chief of the paper, Romualda Fernandes, to try and understand why.
Hello, good to meet you.
Observador has published quite a few articles dismissing concerns about racism in Portugal. One of your columnists called it a myth. What do you say to critics from the black community in particular who say that they actually experience that racism all the time?
Ponto eu acho que somos todos racistas.
I think we're all racist. Racism is something that's part of human nature. It's part of our defense mechanism. This means there's racism everywhere. That's a battle that never ends. However, when it comes to institutional racism, in the sense that there are mechanisms that in one way or another hurt someone because of their race, I don't think that exists in Portugal. If anything, I would argue that only the opposite exists.
On the streets of Lisbon and Porto, you can see a population that is racially diverse. But take a walk through a Portuguese newsroom, and the opposite is true. That might help explain how race gets covered and how racism gets denied. However, Portugal is not the only country with a diversity problem in its newsrooms. For many, this discourse of denial is rooted in something else: Portugal's colonial history. Portugal was the world's first global empire, and a sense of pride in that imperial past runs deep into the present. Here in the capital, Lisbon, tributes honor the colonial era and its architects, from the monument to the Discoveries, which celebrates Portugal's conquests across Africa, Asia and South America in the 15th and 16th centuries, to the Portuguese Parliament, where this mural marks the first encounter between the colonizers and the colonized. Portuguese news outlets are not above dealing in colonial nostalgia either. But with colonialism and its legacy under examination like never before, the media have become the battleground for a tussle over Portugal's past and race relations in the here and now.
We have in our media what I'd call a dispute over historical memory. There's a certain right-wing elite who are trying to glorify the colonial past. For instance, they often say that the Portuguese weren't as racist as other colonizers because they mixed with local populations. They're well aware that people of color are getting more of a voice in the media, and this is part of their strategy to undermine the rise of anti-racist politics.
It's obvious how the media try to romanticize colonialism and the so-called discoveries. But having this discourse about the past is then transferred to the present, with people looking through the same rose-tinted spectacles in both directions, past and present. As a result, the media are incapable of noticing the inequalities that exist in Portuguese society.